I want to show you a map. This is a map of the start of the Bronze Age, some simple city-states, and this is a map at the end of the Bronze Age with these massive empires. What changed? Today, we're going to try to solve the puzzle for how we went from small states to massive empires in the Bronze Age. And you would think this happened because of bronze. No, we went from tiny states to massive empires because of the horse. And there are three parts to this puzzle. The early Bronze Age, where we thought we had domesticated the horse, but new research shows we hadn't. Second, the late Bronze Age, where we actually did domesticate the horse, plus got a bunch of other cool new technology that I want to show you. And then third, we'll show how horses and technology then led us to the Bronze Age collapse. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Reese, and welcome to How Everything Evolved, where we do these research deep dives to help us answer history's juiciest questions. Let's do it. So first, let's talk about the early Bronze Age. And I like to start by contextualizing where we are in history, human history. And you can see this is a map of all of human history. And, here's the Roman Empire or whatever. And then here is the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is like the first third of human history. But the weird thing is, it's almost empty. So here's that graph rotated 90 degrees where you see here's the early Bronze Age, here's the late Bronze Age. And it's weird, at this time, it's like, oh, hey, we had the Egyptian kingdom, but what else was happening? And here's one final amazing graph of human history, and this one's broken into different geographies over time. And so where do you think the Bronze Age is on this timeline? Well, we know it's before the Ottoman, before the Roman Empire. It's even before the Greek Dark Ages. So it's like only this little bit of this graph is actually the Bronze Age. And the first thing to understand about the Bronze Age is that it was all focused around the Near East. Yes, you could think a little bit about India, but the Americas, nothing was really happening. And China only started happening at the very end of the Bronze Age, like 1000 BCE. And so what happened at the beginning of the Bronze Age is some of these new city-states like Egypt and Mesopotamia and Sumer, they were starting to form. They were doing lots of grain. We had just started farming 7,000 years ago. And they were starting to get writing. They were starting to get these palace cultures. And we're starting to actually build up normal civilization. But actually, one of the most important things happening during the early Bronze Age wasn't even in the Near East. But it wasn't in India or China either. It was with the steppe people of the Yamnaya. So this is a group called Yamnaya. These are these pastoralists. And so over time, we started not to just farm plants, but also with animals, we started to domesticate them. The Yamnaya were formed in these steppe, and they were kind of like an opposite of the Mongols, where the Mongols mostly went south from up here. They went to China, they went to, they sacked Baghdad. But the Yamnaya, they actually mostly went west into Europe. And the Yamnaya were important because when they moved west, they replaced a lot of the farmers there. So here's a graph that shows the percentage of modern day European populations with their percentage of Yamnaya steppe pastoralists. And so you can see stuff like Cyprus and Crete, they don't have too many Yamnayas, but most everywhere else is like 30 to 50% Yamnaya genetics. But most importantly, the Yamnaya group were kind of the harbingers and the mimetic seed for Indo-European languages. And so half of languages today are Indo-European. And so all of these ones, plus the ones in the United States, are Indo-European languages. And this all came from the Yamnaya group, where they both spread their genetics to these places, but also spread their language. And you can construct these cool phylogenetic trees where you look at modern words and how they go back in time to like, whoa, this Indian word and this Germanic word and this Latin word all have the same root. And that root is in European languages and the Yamnaya. For both the Yamnaya and in the Near East, the early Bronze Age came to an end around the 4.2 kiloyear event, which is just a term for this 100-year dry period that kind of wiped out the Indus River Valley civilization and kind of weakened the Akkadian civilization and the Egyptian Old Kingdom. And here's a temperature graph that shows that 4.2 kiloyear event, where in the long run, moving away from the ice ages and then into the Holocene, it got so much warmer. This point in time was crazy. This is when the glaciers were everywhere. You could walk to England, and then the glaciers all melted, and it created, 100 meters plus of sea level rise. And so here's this 8.2 kiloyear event, a while back, and then here's this 4.2 kiloyear event. You barely even see it on this graph. And so yes, we did have some of these cold ages or some of these kind of dry periods, but they weren't nearly as extreme as the past. But they were extreme enough to kind of cause some of these early fragile civilizations to collapse or to kind of disassemble. Now let's talk about the second part of this puzzle, the late Bronze Age. And the crucial part about the late Bronze Age is it's when we domesticated the horse. So when you think about the early Bronze Age, we started to form into cities like this. This is early Uruk. And this is interesting and cool, but you can see there's all these people walking around. But then by the late Bronze Age, it looked like this. These crazy chariots, driven by horses. And so I kind of think the Bronze Age is a misnomer. And yes, we did have some of these bronze implements, but it's mostly just what archaeologists found in the record. They're like, oh, here comes the bronze. What was actually important at this time was horse and oxen for draft animals. So let's look at how we domesticated the horse. The horse is really cool. It was actually our first big prey animal as sapiens kind of came onto the scene. And so this is looking at Paleolithic cave art, so tens of thousands of years before the Bronze Age. And when you look at the art, it was mostly horse and bison. But around this time, horse were a prey animal, right? And so you can see this is time going from right to left, and you can see that there were lots of horses, and then we killed all of them, just like we were killing all the other megafauna. And so the crucial thing that happened here is we started to domesticate what was previously a prey animal. And so I like this graph that shows the domestication of animals over time. We started with the dog way back in the day, then we did like the cow and the sheep and the goat, 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BCE, whatever. And then we got the horse, 5,000 years ago, around 3,000 BCE, which is around the Bronze Age. And the key difference between this is that at this time, we were using all of these creatures. It's like, oh, we were using sheep for wool, right? We were using cow as oxen, right? It's like, no. Everything here was just using them for meat. We weren't even using them for milk or for wool or anything. And so then much later, we had the secondary products revolution where we started to use the goat and the sheep. Something like a sheep, we started to actually select for wool, and we started to use it for wool instead of just for meat. And then cows with oxen, instead we castrated them and got these kind of beta bulls, that we could use to do work for ourselves. And same with the horse. Instead of eating it back in the day, we started to actually domesticate it as a draft animal. And here's why that was important. When you think about the muscle energy that was used by humans over time. And so yeah, back in the day, we mostly used human muscles for energy. But then over time, you can see we started to use oxen, around this time, and we started to use horse around this time. And by the year 0, there was as much muscle energy from humans as we had from horse or from oxen. And so the oxen were able to plow the fields and do all that work, while the horses were really important for warfare. And the horse is really interesting because it actually evolved in the Americas, but then came back over the land bridge to Eurasia. On the Americas, they killed the horse. So they didn't have it, the Indians and Native Americans didn't have it until the colonizers brought it, in 1500. But back in Eurasia is where we actually domesticated it. So in the past, people used to think that the Yamnaya were the ones who brought the horse to everybody. They're like, oh, those Yamnaya people, they were kind of these steppe herders. They brought the horse along with Indo-European language, and they brought it everywhere. And people think that happened around 3000 BCE. But that's actually wrong. What we've learned recently is that yes, the Yamnaya did spread, but actually it was 1,000 years later with this Sintasha group. These were the ones who actually domesticated the horse, and they used spoked wheels and chariots to kind of spread the horse chariot complex. And here's this awesome new research paper that shows that. This may be from like 2023 or 2024, super recent. And what this shows is when you track the genetics of horses from today back in time, you see they all come from this Western Eurasian steppe just north of the Caspian Sea around 2000 BCE. Here's another chart that shows that, where they show the genetics of some of these groups. It's like, yeah, all these are like random horses that don't exist today. But then here you can see by 2000 BCE, all of these ones, see the orange here? This is showing that the genetics of all of these horses are from the ones of today. And what that research shows is that there are two big genetic changes that happened to horses at this time. One made them more docile, so it kind of decreased their testosterone, made them less of a prey species, less like zebra, and more like castrated oxen. And the other genetic change that happened was to their backs that enabled them to both carry more weight and not have as bad of back problems. And the really cool thing about horses is that they spread along with the chariot. And so this cool new spoked wheel thing emerged. Instead of these big wheels, we had the potter's wheel, and then we had other wheels, but they were too big. And then these spoked wheels were lighter, and then we got these chariots. And so these chariots really defined, the late Bronze Age warfare, where you had, this is Ramses II battling in this battle of Akash versus the Hittites in the north. And there was this really big battle, 2,000 chariots on each side, and it was kind of the defining battle before the end of the Bronze Age. So when you look at these step changes over time in terms of these biggest empires, it happened because of chariots and the horse, and then later it happened with iron and cavalry, and then much later it happened with gunpowder. But around this time, this is taken from Peter Turchin and his Seshat database plus his new book, and what it shows is that, yeah, this area of empires changed once we got chariots around this time, and then later we'll show how it changed with iron and cavalry. And just to put the nail on the head for why bronze didn't matter, it's not like after the Bronze Age collapse, we then went back to bronze. It was like, no, bronze sucked. Oh, And so you can see over time, this is a graph of, here's the Bronze Age and then here's the Iron Age. You can see that, yeah, we were producing more bronze, maybe 100 tons a year or whatever. But then compared to iron we produce almost 100,000 tons a year, which is like 1,000x more. So bronze was totally just a transitionary metal as we tried to domesticate metals in general. Okay, now let's look at the third part of this puzzle, which is understanding the world right before the Bronze Age collapse. So here's a map of the world right before the Bronze Age collapse. We have the Egyptian New Kingdom being super big, the Hittite Empire being really big. All these places have horses, which is pretty amazing. But bronze is hard to make. Bronze is composed of 90% copper and 10% tin. All the copper came from Cyprus, essentially, but all the tin, we had to bring it from the Hindu Kush over here. We had to bring it from like England over here. And so there was no tin in the actual region where it was all used to make bronze. And so this is why we started to get these empires starting to trade with each other. The gold from Egypt, the Cyprus from copper, some of the timber from Syria, trading for other materials they needed. Kind of like a little proto-settlers board. And you can kind of think of the Near East at the end of the Bronze Age as kind of like a feudal Europe, where you have a bunch of these kind of weak states that are all kind of trading with each other. And they also still used a little proto system of feudalism, where you had some kind of, king-like thing with some people with some horses beneath them, and then mostly just a lot of peasants working the land. I think it's so cool that we can even talk about this time as similar to medieval Europe, because remember, this was like 2,000 years before that. So it's so cool that there was trade happening here, that there were alliances happening here. One of my favorite examples of this are called the Amarna letters, and these are, I think, 300 or 400 different cuneiform tablets that were being sent along the world, mostly from these other states to Egypt, and they were kind of talking to the king of Egypt, and then he was talking back to his vassal states in the land of Canaan, or to his other brother kings in the Hittites or in Mesopotamia. And it's so cool because you can read these and see some of these early trade agreements, but then also after they had this big battle of Kadesh, at the end of it, you can see the first peace agreement in the world where they said, hey, Hittites and Egyptians, we've come to peace. So that's how I understand the Bronze Age. It's not really about bronze. And what we showed is how we went from these small states to these big empires, mostly through the horse. Thanks as always for listening. If you have any questions or feedback, put them in the comments below. And if you want to learn how we got here, check out this video on the 6 cradles of civilization. Or if you want to understand where we're going, the next videos are going to look at the Bronze Age collapse and how it wasn't really a collapse at all. So subscribe here for more. Thanks and bye.